Lawsome by Consultwebs. Breakthrough insights to build a thriving law firm with your host, Tanner Jones.
Hello to all our Lawsome listeners. Today on our show, we're talking with Rachel Wickenheiser, former attorney, Harvard Law graduate, author, and project manager at Consultwebs. After graduating from law school, Rachel clerked for a federal judge and she worked for two top law firms in Washington, D.C. Upon leaving private practice, she worked for the chief administrative law judge at the Federal Communications Commission. She then became the director of the Legal Profession Preparatory Program at the University of Delaware, where she still occasionally teaches as adjunct faculty. Rachel now works as project manager at Consultwebs as an admissions consultant for law and graduate school applicants as well. In August 2022, she published her first book, The Truth About Law School, and that's our topic for today. Welcome, Rachel. Glad to have you. Thanks for making time for the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
First of all, I just want to take a moment to congratulate you on your new book release. Very exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about it too. I started it back in, I think, 2016, so it's been a while in the making.
Love that. Well, all good things take time. So we're excited for that and really want to kind of drill down on the value in that book and what you're offering the legal community. You've obviously covered a lot of interesting topics in this book, but one I'd like to spend a few minutes on here in just a moment is around the reality that you talk about, the reality that potential up-and-coming lawyers are dealing with today, even before they start law school. But before we get to that one, let's start really about you sharing a little bit about the history, what led you to write this book, and ultimately, what was the objective in terms of who you're trying to help with this book?
Yeah, I mean, as the title indicates, it's essentially everything I wish I had known before I went to law school, because there's so many questions that people don't know enough to ask. It's like really any topic. So, you can't, how can you be looking for answers if you don't have the questions? So it's partially that, and then partially just things that I wish I had done differently in hindsight. For instance, one big one is I wish I had taken time off to work between college and law school. So just things that I kind of learned the hard way, that I'm trying to help other people, prevent other people from having to learn the hard way.
I think it's great to save others from the pain we've realized. It's giving back essentially to the community. Let me come back to the thing I mentioned earlier about the reality of being a lawyer. In one of the chapters, you really spend some time talking through this concept and ultimately what encourages or discourages someone to stay or leave within the community. In both educational and professional fields, given your experience to date, what do you think are some of the main areas of opportunity for the legal industry itself, just when it comes to trying to avoid future lawyers from dropping out of the profession?
Yeah, so I think law schools have a big opportunity because a lot of what kind of contributes to the mental health issues that people start having in law school and just kind of the feeling of disassociation is the process of learning to think like a lawyer, because it's a very narrow, specific way of thinking, and there's not enough emphasis on using that kind of thinking only for law and not for life in general. And because there's not, it's all about kind of reason and reasoning from previous cases and, reasoning from statutes. And there's not a lot of emphasis on like emotion and experience, like personal experience. So people tend to not value that side of themselves as much when they go to law school. So I think emphasizing in law school the narrow focus, or I guess I should say the narrow applications of this way of thinking is really important. And the other piece of it, I think a duty that colleges have before law school is helping students who maybe are, they're in their senior year, they're panicking about what comes next. So they're like, oh, I'm good at reading and writing, I'll go to law school. And really helping to help them find other paths or explore potential other paths. And just the constant reminder that whatever you do next doesn't have to be the thing that you do forever. Like you don't have to have the answer right away.
Rachel, I find it interesting. You mentioned mental health, in that comment, and that topic it's been prevalent, and as it should be. And I'm glad we're talking about this more in the legal profession. We actually had Andrea Hall on the show just recently, and she talked specifically about mental health in the legal profession. We talked about the stigma, unfortunately, that exists where lawyers, many of which tend to think they have to have it all figured out. And they put that weight on their shoulders. They're carrying that day in and day out. And naturally, that's leading to compromising mental health and leading to many other bad health decisions for those individuals. And so taking into account your work experience and some of the things you've referenced already, what would you suggest are practical ways that we can begin to help kind of build this infrastructure and these tools for these future lawyers so that they can avoid these types of issues we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think the big thing is really to focus on like systematic support rather than putting the focus on the individual, the focus and the burden on the individual to figure it out for themselves, because that's just even more pressure. So it's like, oh, if I'm feeling pressure, it's my own fault because I'm not taking time to meditate and things like that. When it's really something that does require system-wide change. I think at the law school level, one thing that I actually recommended when I was in law school is like required mental health screenings for law students, especially 1L a year when you're just getting started and it's just a whole new way of thinking. The problem we run into, because when I did bring up this proposal when I was in law school, they were like, the mental health department at the university was like, we've actually explored this a little bit, but students aren't interested in it. And I think it's not that students aren't interested. I think it's an underlying fear that they'll be penalized in some way if it gets out that they have these mental health issues. So I think systematic support has to include people higher up, whether it's in law school or once you're actually working as a lawyer, being open about these issues. I talk in the book a little bit about duck syndrome, the idea that you're acting like everything's fine on the surface, like a duck floating on the surface, but underneath, their feet are paddling frantically. So I think anything we can do to encourage those conversations on a frequent basis. So not just like a one-off mental health day, but really something that is incorporated regularly is going to be critical.
I do believe, just as you're suggesting, it's the higher ups. It's being able to talk about it honestly, and when I say honestly, truly honestly, and having some of those candid conversations. And I believe that's where true change and true improvement begins to happen. But I'd like to turn the interview around, pointed to you. You've led a very impressive professional career, Rachel. You've worked, as mentioned earlier, 2 top law firms in D.C., became the director of the Legal Profession Preparatory Program at the University of Delaware, and you've always been in and around the legal industry. Even now, being a project manager at Consultwebs, now working in the marketing realm, supporting law firms. In all that you've learned, what would you say is the most significant learning experience that you've had in this career?
I think the biggest thing that I've learned, that honestly I'm still learning because it's probably the thing that comes least naturally to me, is keeping the big picture in mind. So it's not just about the specific task you're working on, but really the larger project, the larger interests. And really thinking about people's interests and not just, the specific thing you've been asked to do. And this is true for both clients and for just, your manager, the people you're working for. I think kind of a good rule of thumb to keep in mind is, how do I make their lives easier? Because you do need to keep kind of that bigger picture in mind and not just be like, well, I did my thing, so I'm out.
Our careers, it's interesting. You can talk with, any lawyer out there, and you're likely going to hear somewhat of a unique story, a unique path, and what led them to where they're at. We each have our own unique stories to tell, but I find yours rather interesting, and I'm seeing more and more lawyers stepping out of practice and going into areas like marketing, much like what you have. And so for the listener who may be in that seat or contemplating that potential change, what advice would you offer someone who's considering maybe stepping out of law, or maybe even finishing up law school and deciding in this moment, maybe practicing law isn't for me, but maybe marketing in the legal profession is? What guidance would you offer there?
Yeah, I think, well, just general advice, not specific to marketing. If you're not sure if you want to stay in law, or if you know that you don't, but you're not sure what to try next, I would go back to what I said earlier, which is just, keep in mind that it's okay to try things, and whatever you do next doesn't have to be the thing you do forever. One of my favorite books, which I discovered when I was at the University of Delaware working with the Career Center, is called Designing Your Life. And it really talks about the concept of wayfinding, which is just making small corrections with each new experience. And I think when it comes to the course of your career, or careers plural, as the case may be, that's really helpful to keep in mind. And the other piece of general advice I would say is to look at what the more senior folks are doing in the place where you're working, and just asking yourself, is that something I would like better? Do I just need to put my time in until I get to a position where I like the specific role that I'm in better? Or am I looking at what those folks are doing and being like, no, that actually might even be worse? And in terms of marketing specifically, I think lawyers already have a lot of marketing skills that they don't necessarily realize, because it's part of the aspect of being an advocate for your client. So you're basically marketing their position. So it's just taking the skills that you learn doing that as part of advocacy and just applying it in in a different way.
I love that parallel. I've never heard that parallel, but it makes sense, and I do see the skill sets aligning well, even in that pivot. I'd be curious to know, and this is more of just out of curiosity. Now that you've spent time in both realms, both practicing law and supporting a law practice, and also on the marketing side, what have you found to be the more enjoyable?
I definitely prefer project management. I think leaving law was the right choice.
Yeah.
I was okay as a lawyer. There were some things that I did very well as a lawyer, and there were other things that I was at. But one of my favorite pieces of being a lawyer, especially, as I was in practice for a few years, was really managing teams. So when I was thinking about leaving law, I was like, oh wait, this is itself, a career position. So that's when I started exploring project management. Mm-hmm. And actually, one area of law that I was interested in as a law student was cyber law and different things that incorporated technology. So I'm really fortunate to be able to kind of explore in a similar way that interest in working with, our design team, our development team, our SEO team, in terms of that technical knowledge and that technological those technological features that I get to play with.
You have unique skill sets and experiences, which clearly make you a tremendous asset to the Consultwebs team, a group that provides digital marketing services to lawyers across the country. And I'd be, I have my own perspectives of this, just in terms of being able to see the benefits. I've seen Consultwebs continue to find and attract lawyers from, whether practicing lawyers or non-practicing lawyers, and leveraging those unique experiences and skill sets in our operations with respect to content development, messaging, project management, business development, you name it. But I'd love to hear from you specifically, Rachel, having those experiences on both sides of the coin, if you will. How have you seen that personally helping you or fuel your work in the legal marketing realm?
Yeah, I think probably the two most important aspects would be one, like just being able to speak the language and just understand maybe some of the more technical terms that clients are using. Um, that's just always helpful. It's not required, you can always Google terms, but it's helpful just in the moment. And then the second aspect is just understanding where our clients are coming from, especially, when we're working with, for instance, trial lawyers, and they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to be in a trial next week. I know that means that they're going to be inaccessible because I know too well that they won't be sleeping that week. So just kind of being able to relate to them in that way.
That's so good. So I'd like to end, if you would, Rachel, just by sharing how can our listeners get access to the book? Where can they go to find that?
It's available on Amazon. It's called The Truth About Law School, and you can get it either as an ebook or a paperback.
Fantastic. Rachel, any final thoughts or remarks you'd like to share before we wrap up?
There is just one thing I wanted to add, which is why I did leave law, because that's a question I get a lot, especially as like a Harvard Law School alumna. People are like, how do you go from that to just being a project manager? And I left law because it's kind of inherently confrontational and adversarial, and I was having a really difficult time with that. Some people can, just treat it as work, like not take it personally, and just kind of see it as the nature of the job. But for me, that was just incredibly difficult. So that's kind of what spurred me to think about leaving law. And as I mentioned earlier, my favorite part of work as being a lawyer was managing case teams. So I'm excited that I'm now at Consultwebs doing this work. And certainly the work-life balance is better.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's an inspiration truly for someone who has invested time and money in a direction and just feeling that internal disturbance of, where do I go next? I think your story should be an encouragement and a motivator to those individuals. And we're grateful for you being willing to not only share your story through your book, but join us here on the Lawsome Podcast.
Yeah, thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Rachel.
Lawsome by Consultwebs with Tanner Jones. For show notes, links, and info, go to consultwebs.com/podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Watch for the next Lawsome episode to discover more breakthrough insights to build a thriving law firm.